Hello, everyone. I was thinking because of a tweet that reminded me about this subject that it might be helpful for some people if I explain the issues I have with certain terms in the trans community. If you haven't heard of these terms, I would say you're kind of blessed in that regard. So, what they are is TMA and TME. They stand for trans misogyny affected and trans misogyny excluded or exempt. Sorry. So the thing about these terms is they fail to really account for the way that bigotry actually functions. Because bigotry isn't simply a function of how you identify. Rather, it's very much affected by how people see you. Uh, when a cis woman who isn't gender conforming enough or is deemed too masculine in some way, uh, and someone like assaults her or calls the cops on her or harasses her in the bathroom because they think that she's a trans woman, well, clearly she's being affected by trans misogyny. She's not a trans woman. That doesn't make her, and it doesn't make her like entitled to our experiences, but she is affected by trans misogyny. I would say that's pretty undebatable. Another example would be all the times that trans men are affected by regular old misogyny. It's not that they are women, but that they are subject to the bigotry towards women by the transphobes who don't see them as men. There's plenty of other examples I think I could go with. People who, I mean, even a cis man can be subject to trans misogyny or simply being gender nonconforming for wearing a skirt or painting their fingernails or whatever. And so it, like I said, it's not a function of, well, if you identify as a trans woman, well, then suddenly that flips a switch where suddenly you're affected by trans misogyny. And it just isn't how reality works. So, because of that, the idea of being trans misogyny affected and trans misogyny exempt, uh, they treat being affected by these things as like a state of being, a state of existing, and that's just not reality. If I exist in a space and I parse as a cis woman to a lot of people, then there are a lot of instances where trans misogyny won't affect me directly. I'm not saying that passing privilege is a thing, because, I mean, the fact that I have to rely on people assuming I'm cis is its own problem, but there are forms of trans misogyny that I won't be as subject to. The other big issue that I have with these terms is a lot of the people that I see use them. Uh, these people generally seem to have some sort of uh, axe to grind with trans men and transmasc people in general. One thing that was actually kind of disillusioning after I came out as trans was realizing how many trans women and trans feminine or trans femme, I don't know what fucking term, uh, people see trans men and trans masks as having it easy, or even some of them seeing trans men and trans masks as our oppressors. And that's another thing that, like, I'm saying is just not reality. I Trans men have their own experiences and their own struggles that often take the form of trans misandry. And when trans women try to act like trans men have it easy because they're not affected, they're not affected by trans misogyny, affected there being what they claim and not necessarily reality. Uh, trans, just a lot of trans women who think they're not affected by this, they have it easier, or they're whatever, and ignore things like, you know, the specific risks that come with being a trans man and having to decide if you feel safe using the men's restroom. It's not to say trans women are always safe using the women's restroom, but there are instances of trans men being raped because they tried to use the restroom for their gender. Should we suddenly, if we're going to use TMA and TME as trans misogyny affected, trans misogyny exempt, well, those abbreviations could just as easily mean trans misandry affected, trans misandry exempt. Uh, I've also noticed that a lot of the people who use TMA and TME uh, take issue with the idea of trans misandry being a thing. They're very resistant to the idea that trans men have their own unique struggles and have their own specific experiences that aren't simply general transphobia. It's sort of an oppression Olympics thing. I Sometimes this term gets used in bad ways, but it is certainly an insistence that, you know, we have it harder. And the fact is, like, some of us do. And there are ways in which we might have it harder than other queer people, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that other queer people don't have it harder in other ways. Plus, there's also just, you know, a lot of black queer people, for example, who have it worse than tons and tons and tons of white trans women. I think when you start throwing around these terms like trans misogyny affected, exempt, etc. You sort of try to compartmentalize oppression. And apart from the other issues I mentioned, I don't think it's a good strategy for fighting for our rights and fighting for progress. If you, it just separates us. And it encourages this resentment and bitterness that can only make it harder for us to work together against the things that oppress all of us. I think only capitalism and homophobia and transphobia are, I think only those things are helped when we try and pull these things like trans misogyny affected. This trying to claim that we're the only ones affected by it, when instead we should be pointing out that other people are affected by it, saying, we aren't the only ones being hurt by this. You're being hurt by it too. And we think that we should work together to fix it. There's a lot of camaraderie that can be built that way, and those terms stand in opposition to that. I know this was kind of rambling. This wasn't scripted at all. I didn't really plan this out. I had a like a few bullet points in my head that I wanted to cover. I'm not sure how useful this will be for other people, um, but if it is helpful for anyone, I'll be extremely happy about that. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.